time I come clean with the media and all Canadians that the hip replacement I had in 2007 involved a defective part. So believe it or not, I may be the squeaky wheel in Parliament, but I'm also the squeaky hip. So the Parliamentary Protective Services have said to me for some time, Madam May, you cannot sneak up on us. We hear you coming. So as I walk, I almost mentioned it last weekend at the Parliamentary Press Gallery dinner. I thought, should I confess that I actually squeak as I walk, a part implanted in my body? And when you think about it, what kind of irony is it that someone who's campaigned for years, I used to be the lawyer for the Public Interest Advocacy Center and for consumer protections. Anyway, I'm not complaining. My hip doesn't hurt. I'm blessed to be in a country with a healthcare system that ensures anyone who needs knee and hip replacements will get them, even if you have to wait. It's not a life-threatening condition, but I never thought I'd end up being someone who, as I walk, I squeak. Can't tell you how many people stop in the woods and say, I hear a bird. Just a moment. I know what it is. And I say, no, it's my hip. No, it was a bird. All right, so to the purpose of today's brief press resume of where we are on Wednesday with Parliament shuttering Friday evening for the next until the third week of January, I wanted to review where we are and the concerns I have as a member of Parliament. There is a lot of legislation yet to be passed, but more fundamentally, there's a lot of legislation yet to be studied. Pour moi, comme député, j'ai le grand honneur d'être le député de Saint-Gilles-de-Golfe il y a presque 15 ans. Alors, c'est une surprise pour moi aussi. Mais dans tout le temps quand j'étais le député de Saint-Gilles-de-Golfe, c'est la première fois où les droits des députés, le processus de démocratie dans notre système parlementaire, s'est menacé par l'approche du bureau du Premier ministre. C'est un fondamental manque de respect pour le Parlement lui-même. So we have a lot of bills, not that much of a legislative agenda. Had I been Prime Minister at the end of the election, would have started with saying what bills died on the order paper, which ones should we take up soon, because some of them have been studied, some were at the point of being passed, and unfortunately on January 6th they died. In the normal course of things, I would have expected the government of the day to say, let's pick these up. Bill C-33, for example, which was ready at report stage. There were others ready for third reading, and say these have broad support across Parliament. In any case, that isn't the approach the Prime Minister took. And we have had, since the election, most of the bills brought forward fall in the category of omnibus bills, with many changes made within one piece of legislation, and with an approach that great speed can be conveyed to the Canadian public and may, in fact, represent competence and decisiveness. I'm not going to judge or be partisan about it. I'm just making sure Canadians know that legislation passed in this place is being passed without adequate study. Certainly Bill C-5, the Part 1, which was about reducing barriers between provinces for trade, is a goal I totally support, but I couldn't vote for Part 1 of Bill C-5, and I certainly couldn't vote for Part 2 of Bill C-5, the so-called Build Canada Act. Much has been confused and confusing since the great urgency that bill needed to be passed in June. Very few people will remember, other than those of us who lived through it, that at every stage the Liberal agenda was supported by whipped votes for the Conservatives, so that we had a so-called programming motion, which meant that Bill C-5 was not studied in committee virtually at all. In fact, second reading for the bill took place on Monday, June 16th, where no committee had yet been struck to study it. Tuesday, June 17th, committee was struck to study it, to start at 3:30 in the afternoon and conclude its meeting at 5:30. I won't go through the rest of the week. The bill was through all stages and passed from the House of Commons by Friday, June 20th. Since then, we also had, before C-5, we had introduced Bill C-2, which was called the Strong Borders Act, C2 over the course of the summer attracted hundreds of civil society organizations to form a coalition. Groups such as Open Media, Association of Refugee Lawyers, Civil Liberties Associations, saying C2 should be completely withdrawn. I thought we'd seen some progress when in the fall, and we reconvened, the Strong Borders Act, or parts of it, were reintroduced as Bill C12, which I wrongfully thought meant that C2 was dead. We now have both C2 and C12 on the order paper, with the government having announced that removing from C12, the new version of the Strong Borders Act, some of the worst elements of C2, the warrantless opening of mail and access to internet information, are not in C12, but we've now been advised by government that as soon as C12 is passed, C2 will come back with those sections in it again. This is obviously very confusing for civil society organizations trying to stay on top of this. It's even confusing for members of parliament. The Green Party put forward numerous amendments to C12, clause by clause, as did, and a credit to the New Democratic Party and member for East Vancouver, Jenny Kwan, who also put forward amendments. Jenny's amendments and mine were quite similar in their goals, if not in the exact wording, in that we were both trying to protect refugee rights from the way C12 is currently drafted. Our amendments were defeated, but unfortunately, amendments that constitute even more of an assault on refugee rights were carried in committee, and it remains to be seen whether when C12 comes to report stage in this place and then third reading, we will have an opportunity. I have amendments ready. I'm hoping to present them. Ms. Kwan has agreed to second my amendments. We'll see if the Speaker accepts them. But I find C12 quite offensive, objectionable, and I also find, again, as someone who's served in this place since 2011, I've never seen anything like the government bringing forward a bill like C2, only to bring forward, without withdrawing C2, a bill that's virtually the same, C12, and then say, when we get through C12, we can bring in C2 with the amendments that strip out the parts we've already passed. So it reminds me more of a shell game than anything I've seen in Parliament before. Bill C4, speaking of interesting tricks, is the Affordability Act. And as I mentioned, bills are omnibus bills. C4 contains within it Part 4. Now, Affordability Act, no surprise to people, and certainly the Carney Liberals campaigned on it to get rid of the consumer carbon price. So while I disagree, I can't claim we weren't warned that C4, the Affordability Act, gets rid of our carbon pricing system for consumers. But what's curious is Part 4 of Bill C4, which are amendments to the Elections Act. Now, the only connection I can make to affordability is to perhaps save the Liberal Party legal fees, and that could make it affordability. But Elections Act amendments, Part 4 of Bill C4, are to remove the very few sections in the Elections Act that protect Canadians' personal information controlled by political parties. The sections that protect personal information are under Bill C4. The language is that they are deemed never to have entered into force and are repealed. One would think that was clear enough in terms of nailing it down. But then, I've never seen this before, Part 4 of Bill C4 will be deemed, once we pass it here, will be deemed to have come into effect May 31st, 2000. That's right, 25 years ago. Interesting. So, again, what's being evaded here, what kind of personal information is in the hands of political parties that require a time machine to undo whatever mischief there might be in allowing the sections merely to be repealed, but not just repealed as of now, never existed back to the year 2000. So again, haste, I've always, old truisms are often true. Haste makes waste. Passing bills quickly doesn't mean that we're decisive. It just may mean we're not doing our jobs. C9 is another one that concerns me greatly. I never had a chance to speak to Bill C9, nor have I had a chance to vote on it, because increasingly bills go through to second reading, quote unquote, on division, which means that only the recognized parties in Parliament have anything to say about second reading. The recognized parties being the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the Bloc Québécois, which means that the NDP members of Parliament and myself, in the past, we would have had the right, 5 of us, to stand up and say, we asked for a recorded vote. I haven't been able to record my position on C9, haven't had a speech on it, and haven't been able to vote on it because I've been, like the other New Democrat MPs, swept up in passed on division. The parts of C9 that I find objectionable are the parts that affect civil liberties. Most of the debate right now is around the religious text exemption on hate speech. But I find it very worrying to imagine that you could be in a location and not know that behind you there's an offensive image, a Hezbollah flag or a swastika, something you wouldn't want to be anywhere near, and at the same time not know that you're 2 blocks from a house of worship where such symbols are particularly hateful. This is an unnecessary, draconian approach to public expressions of concern. Our rights to free speech, our rights to free assembly by C9. So I say it today in a press conference because I haven't had in a moment been allowed to say it on the floor of the House of Commons. But that's almost nothing compared to the Budget Implementation Act, which we've still not voted on, which is over 600 pages long. And the devil's in the details, as we know. The idea that you need an omnibus budget bill and that you don't need to really look at it, we're told in the House of Commons. Everything in here, I've heard from the Liberal MPs, everything here was in the budget. So this is merely implementing the budget. And I put to you, there was nothing in the budget that required changes to the International Rivers Improvements Act or the Migratory Birds Convention or the Canada Wildlife Act. But more concerning are the changes found on pages 301 to 304 of the Budget Implementation Act. Page 301 to 304 of the Budget Implementation Act puts in place something never mentioned in the budget, that ministers will now have personal discretion to decide if an entity, and an entity is defined as a person or a corporation or an association, or it's basically anything. If an entity asks a minister to exempt them from any Canadian law, the minister can do so, or 2 ministers can do so together, and the only thing they can't exempt an entity from obeying is the criminal code. But any other laws, it's okay. And the ministers will make it public that they have exempted this entity from having to obey said laws as soon as it is, quote unquote, feasible. There is no timeline on when the ministers might decide it's feasible. So in terms of transparency, then you've got the question of what level of detail must the ministers provide to the public. There's a big swath of exemptions, exceptions. You don't have to tell the public if there's personal or confidential information, I assume confidential business information as well, Canadians won't need to know. This is in the guise of cutting red tape, and when I asked about it yesterday in the House, and as far if memory serves, and I certainly need to search Hansard, but I don't think any other member of Parliament has focused on this section of Bill C-15. When would we have had time? We have had, I did get to give a speech on Bill C-15 on November 27th, and I pointed out the various sections I found objectionable. This one, though, rises above all the others. Why are ministers to be given such wide personal discretion to say that laws don't apply? That's been a theme since Bill C-5, when this Prime Minister's office, for the first time ever, invoked the Henry VIII clause that most Canadians haven't heard of, that Henry VIII decreed that if he brought into place a decree or a law that violated previous of his laws or decrees, that was okay because he's Henry VIII. When last June, when this came in Bill C-5, and Liberals told me, but we ran on this. This was in our platform. Because I'm very fond of my colleagues and because I don't mind a good laugh now and then, I said, I don't remember that the Liberal campaign theme song was I'm Henry VIII, I am. I don't think that the Henry VIII clause formed any part of the platform of the Liberal Party of Canada. In any case, the Henry VIII clause also reigns through Bill C-15, particularly the sections found on Cutting Red Tape, pages 301 to 304. Lastly, I wanted to touch on something that the Parliament should be seized with. I think we should be debating and discussing, and Canadians should be paying a lot of attention to Donald Trump's new 2025 national security strategy, which represents, if we thought that the world order was being ripped to shreds, this puts it in black and white, and it's a public policy document from the United States that's deeply distressing. It basically says the United States has no allies, the U.S. is only out for itself. Not really a surprise, I suppose. It's called the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and it specifically takes aim at Europe. I find this language very distressing. Economic decline, this is quote, is eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure. The larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies. Through this document is a clear incitement to support the most right-wing populists and fascists within the European Union to interfere in domestic elections within Europe and to support those that would like to do away with international institutions, with the rule of law, potentially with NATO itself. They target that these horrible transnational bodies undermine political liberty and sovereignty through censorship of free speech, suppression of political opposition, loss of national identities, and self-confidence. So nationalistic, white supremacist, misogynist, against immigration, you bet. Also against the Paris Agreement, against climate action. But I have to say that given that Canada shares those values, when we expand our trading relationships, I think we should be seeking out countries that have shared values with us, which obviously with Europe we do. Respect for democracy, respect for human rights, and somehow this document landing right now, I guess some people might look at it and think, well, phew, it doesn't even mention Canada. But I think Canadians will see in this a direct assault on our values, on democratic values, and on the critical importance of hanging on to democracies, of defending Ukraine. This document, this new national security strategy from Trump, is transparent in its alignment with Russia as a strategic ally, and not democracies, and not countries that have deep respect for human rights. So again, America, quote, this is, quote, America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote this revival of spirit and the growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives cause for great optimism. Our goal should be to help Europe correct its current trajectory. We will need a strong Europe to help us successfully compete and to work in concert with us to prevent any adversary from dominating Europe, etc. So this is something that I think Canadians should be talking about. I wish in our Parliament we had more opportunity to look at big picture issues, but our Parliament has been dominated by abbreviated debates, and unfortunately, and I certainly understand why some parties have decided that in the face of being bulldozed with bills, the appropriate thing is simply to create obstructions. Mais ce n'est pas suffisant. On doit faire le travail pour le peuple du Canada. C'est notre devoir et nous devons le faire. Maintenant, nous sommes dans une période où le Parlement lui-même n'est pas, nous n'avons pas l'efficacité, nous n'avons pas la capacité de prendre les débats sérieux, de participer dans les débats respectueux. Ça, c'est un autre problème, le comportement des députés. We've had a problem with the lack of respect in Parliament for quite a while. I had hoped it would get better. I don't think it has, but we're also facing a time where I have sympathies for any party that says we don't like being bulldozed. So I'm often, as the Green Party leader in the House of Commons, because I don't heckle, I can only think quietly to myself, a plague on all your houses. But I work for Canada. I want policies that put Canada first, and I want to think of the whole world in the way that we do as Canadians, with our legacy of leadership from people like former Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, someone who actually was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for work that deserved a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm quite certain, and it was before he was Prime Minister, I think, as we all know, in the Suez Crisis, that Lester B. Pearson invented international peacekeeping. We need to step up into our history and our legacy pour protéger les droits humains, pour protéger les institutions multilatérales comme les Nations Unies, comme les autres coalitions des démocraties et avec les autres amis du Canada, les nations qui partagent nos valeurs. And I do think we're a country that has its values. So regardless of my deep concern with the direction that the Prime Minister is currently taking us, obviously with the agreement with Alberta, but compared to what's happening, where's Canada's place in the world under Trump's new national security strategy? That should be preoccupying us far more than it is. With that, merci pour l'occasion de parler avec tout le monde ici, et je suis disponible pour les questions. Thank you. Yes.
All right, we're going to forego the questions and answers period. I hope you will leave your thoughts and opinions in the chat. We'll be back. Have a good morning. Bye-bye.